today talking a little bit about Israel. So without further ado, I invite Ilan Sinelnikov.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. It's not an easy one to remember.
It's not.
Ilan, it's a pleasure that you're here.
Thank you very much.
This morning, so the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay. Well, Shavua Tov, everyone. And here, I'll stand right here. I'll be right here so I can see everyone a little bit better. So Shavua Tov, everyone. It's very nice to be here, and thank you very much for the invite. I know that Valeria contacted me to come to speak at the congregation, and it's truly remarkable to know that the Jewish community cares so much about what is happening in Ukraine nowadays, especially with the Jewish community in Ukraine as well. So this is actually my third engagement this weekend already. I was in Miami yesterday, in West Palm yesterday, and today I'm here in Plantation. So thank you for inviting me, I appreciate it. Now, my name is Ilan Sinelnikov, and I'm the president of Students Supporting Israel. And I'll tell you in a second what is my connection to Ukraine. Now, what I do in my day-to-day work, I founded an organization called Students Supporting Israel as a reaction to all the Israel Apartheid Week and all those bad events on college campuses 10 years ago at the University of Minnesota. Our mission was to be a clear and confident pro-Israel voice and to support students in grassroots activism. Slowly we grew up in Minnesota, then we spread to other campuses across the Midwest, in Iowa, in Nebraska, so a lot of places that people from Florida never even been to. But we kept growing, and we ended up working nowadays on nearly 200 college campuses in the United States, in Canada, and in Argentina as of a year and a half ago. So what I do is working with college students in order to give them the tools and give them the opportunities in order to support Israel on their campus. And actually we're starting clubs right here in Florida as well right now at FAU at the University of Miami. So if anyone has any students or relatives or grandkids or kids that go to one of those two schools, we'll be happy to have them on our team. Now, what is my connection to Ukraine? So about 4 months ago, I returned from Kyiv. I was in Kyiv 4 months ago, and I went there on a delegation of Jewish American leaders with an organization called the NCSEJ for the 80th anniversary events to Babi Yar. Now, what is Babi Yar for some of the people that don't know? Babi Yar was the largest massacre of Jews during World War II, in which between September 29th and September 31st of 1941, the Nazis and their Ukrainian collaborators killed 33,000 Jews, residents of the city of Kyiv, in a matter of 72 hours, which is something that it's very hard to think of. It's like almost you take out a stadium and you just kill all the people there in 3 days. And unfortunately, I am a descendant of Holocaust survivors, as 14 family members of mine were killed in Babi Yar as well. And another family member of mine, Leonid Ostrovsky, he was a prisoner of war in Babi Yar, and he managed to escape. On an attempted escape of over 400 prisoners of war, he managed to escape when only 18 succeeded. And out of them, only 7 stayed alive after the war. So my connection to Babi Yar is a sad connection. It's not necessarily a positive connection. And arriving to Ukraine on that delegation for the 80th anniversary of the events as a proud Jew, as an Israeli, as an American citizen, as a descendant to Holocaust survivors, was closing of a circle for me. And also as the president of Students Supporting Israel. When we were walking near the Ravens where the Jews were massacred, and something that people don't know nowadays, it's that when we think about Jewish people being killed in the Holocaust, we usually think about gas chambers, about Auschwitz, about Dachau, but we don't think about 3 million Jews that were killed in Eastern Europe, not by gas, but by bullets. When the Nazis were standing in front of them, looking at the people they're shooting, and just shooting them down to their death, stripping them away from their clothes, from their dignity, killing elderly, killing young people, 3 million Jews, and this is called nowadays the Holocaust by bullets. And this is something that we're learning a little bit more. Now, another connection that I have to Ukraine is that my great-grandfather, Isaac Estes, he lost both of his parents in a pogrom in Ukraine. So when he was born in 1914 in a city called Khmelnyk, which is near the Ukraine, in this part of town, and both of his parents were killed in a pogrom. So this is my immediate connection to Ukraine. And people might ask, so why do we need to support what is happening there, to support Ukraine and what is going on nowadays, right? Because it's not necessarily the most Jewish-loving people out there in Ukraine. So when I was in the delegation there, we met with many officials. We met with Vitaly Klitschko, which is the mayor of the city of Kyiv, and he also known for being the world heavyweight boxing champion in the past. So a very big guy, now runs the city of Kyiv. The heads of our delegation met with President Vladimir Zelensky, which some people might not know, but maybe in a few years he'll be one of the most influential Jewish people in the world. And Ukraine will come a long way from murdering so many Jews to having a Jewish man that saved their country from the Russian invasion. It's still going, but we'll see what will happen. We also met with the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, which is also Jewish. And we also learned that nearly 50% of the Ukrainian parliament members have some sort of Jewish descent or blood in them. So we noticed that a lot of the Ukrainian leadership nowadays, it's actually a lot of Jewish people. Now, as we were there at the events, we also met with the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog. This was his first official tour as the president outside of Israel to Ukraine. So we were there at the events with him. And something that is very common in all of the meetings that we attended and all of the people that we have seen, they said that Ukraine is fighting anti-Semitism, and we went a whole 180. Now, how much of the 180 they went, it's still, we can debate about it. But we do know for a fact that Ukraine made a big step towards fighting anti-Semitism and also criminalized anti-Semitic crimes now. So if someone commits an anti-Semitic crime, it is criminalized and there is penalty for it. Ukraine also worked to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism in the parliament, and their relations with the state of Israel is very close. So if Israelis today, if the Jewish people can travel to Berlin and can have good relations with Germany, there is no reason to why Israelis and the Jewish people shouldn't be able to travel to Kyiv or have good relations with Ukraine nowadays. Now, I want to talk about why we should care about what is happening in Ukraine. Because for me, I know why I care. My family had some cultural effects on them when they came from Ukraine to Israel, 4 generations. They lived there for their whole life. They grew up there. Now, two of my dad's first cousins still nowadays live in Kyiv, and they both paramedics, and it was very hard to get a hold of them yesterday especially, and 2 days ago, because they were saying that basically we're pretty busy right now, but something common that we have heard from them is that they're not planning to leave Kyiv. They want to stay there. They're not trying to go anywhere. And they will fight the Russians and they will win. This is a very common theme that we have heard from my dad's cousins when we spoke to them on the phone, when we managed to get a hold of. So this is another reason to why I should care. But why we should care here as a congregation and as Jewish community. Something that we might not know is that nearly 100 to 200,000 Jewish people still live in Ukraine today. And they made Ukraine their home. And if Jewish people can live in Brazil, if Jewish people can live in France, in the United States, in Argentina, they can also live in Ukraine. And when the Jewish community is at risk, especially 100 to 200,000 people, it is our responsibility to raise awareness about what is happening there and to support them. Now, some people might ask, why did the Jewish community in Kyiv, or of course in the rest of Ukraine, didn't live? Why can't they just get up and go? But this is not always that easy, because the Jewish community in Ukraine is not necessarily a rich community, and it's also made out of a lot of elderly people and a lot of young people, so they can't just pack and live. And you know, nowadays I'm trying to convince my great-grandfather to move 20 minutes closer to my house, so let it be alone convincing elderly people to get out their country and go somewhere else in which they don't even speak the language. So it's a little bit complicated. You can't just get up and live. And we need to also come to terms with understanding that there are Jewish people that decided to make Ukraine their home today, just like there are Jewish people that decided to make the United States their home today. And we need to make sure that we support them and we help them and we make sure that their life is not at risk or at jeopardy, because we know that in every place where Jewish people were at risk throughout history, democracy was always at jeopardy. So in every place where Jewish people were attacked, in every place where Jewish people were beaten up or killed, democracy was always at risk in those places. And this is what we see nowadays in Ukraine as well. Now, there are many other reasons to why we should care about the situation that is happening in Ukraine, and not just my cousins or my family, but also because Ukraine, it's an example for us to what is happening nowadays in the world and what we as the Jews should kind of be aware or watch out for. Ukraine, no one is showing up to defend them. No other country is sending soldiers to fight the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So what is our lesson for it as Israel, as the Jewish people? And we know in the history that no one has came to help us during the Holocaust. No one have came to help Israel when 7 Arab armies attacked Israel in 1948. And if the bad days will come today, no one will come today to help Israel either. It will be our fight, and it will be our fight to win. And when the situation in Ukraine unfolds like it is today, countries like Iran are watching. And countries like Iran that's building a nuclear arsenal, or trying at least to build a nuclear arsenal, and when they also say every day that they will destroy Israel, the state that is the home to 55% of the Jewish community worldwide, we should probably take them up on their word. We should trust them on what they say. Because 4 months ago in Kyiv, no one could, in their normal mind, possibly believe that Russia will actually attack. They're not going to attack, they're going to stay on the border, they just try to scare us to negotiate. And an attack was almost a scenario that no one could even possibly think of. But the fact of the matter is that when President Putin said that they will attack Ukraine, he did. And he ignored the international community, he ignored, of course, other calls, and he did what he believed he needs to do. So when countries like Iran say they will attack and they're building nuclear weapons to destroy us, we should probably take it seriously and not just kind of let it go and hope that one day we'll go to sleep and wake up in the next morning when our freedoms might be lost. Now, something else to know from the Ukrainian situation is that in 1994, Ukraine gave up on its nuclear arsenal because in 1994, in an agreement between Ukraine, which was a new country, new sovereign country, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia, they promised Ukraine that if they're going to give away their nuclear arsenal, they will guarantee their security. Okay, so Russia was one of the signers on the agreement 30 years ago. So the questions to be asked is, if those world powers 30 years ago say, we'll guarantee your security if you're going to disarm yourself, but 30 years later, hey, circumstances change and we're going to invade you or occupy you. So how can a country like Israel, for example, even trust the world's superpowers to say that, well, let's let them build a nuclear weapon. We'll guarantee your security. Okay, we don't want to wake up one day knowing that our children, 30 years down the road, their security is not guaranteed because someone has changed their mind, or new leaders were elected, or policies were changed. And Menachem Begin, the former prime minister of Israel, when Israel bombed the nuclear reactor in Iran, and the whole world went crazy about it, he said that now we can promise our children, our beloved children, that they will always be protected in the land of Israel. And this is another lesson to us from the situation in Ukraine nowadays. And then, what are some other reasons to why we should care? We should care because in 2022, it is unheard of that a country will just go in and occupy another country because they decided to do so. And it is our responsibility, as much as we can. Everyone can pitch in 5% of energy towards it, or 95% of energy. It depends what everyone can do, if it's speaking about it or any other way. It is our responsibility that we fight it and we don't let that happen as much as we can. And I'll tell you why. Some of the propaganda we hear against Ukraine right now, it's the same propaganda we hear against Israel. I was working on college campuses for 10 years. What are the most common things we hear? Israel has no right to exist, say the people that don't like Israel on college campuses. What do the Russians say? Ukraine, it's a made-up country. It has no right to exist. What else is being said on college campuses? Israel is committing genocide on the Palestinian people, which we know it's a lie. It's a lie, and it's important we debunk that lie. And what does the Russians say? They say that Ukraine is committing a genocide on the Russian-speaking population. Okay, so it's the same arguments that are being said and repeated time after time by dictatorial leaders, by terrorist organizations, or by activists on Western college campuses. Same arguments, and it's important that we see those arguments, we know how to combat them, and we make sure that we do whatever we can in order to raise awareness on the issue and take those things seriously. Okay, because once again, the worst thing that can happen to us, it's saying that it's all a joke, but then we wake up one day knowing that there is a war right at our front yard. So those are some of the reasons to why we as a Jewish community should care. And this is basically nowadays the situation in Ukraine. Now, what is happening as of this morning, we know that we know that Ukraine is fighting back and pushing back. We know that there will be some talking and attempts for negotiations on the Ukrainian and Belarusian border with Ukrainian and Russian officials. And we know that the Russians didn't have it as easy as they thought they would have it. Because one of the things that I spoke to the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, I was on a phone call with her and other leaders from the organization I'm involved with 2 days ago, and they said that Russians banked on the fact that the Ukrainian government will leave Ukraine, will get out, let it be by being airlifted in the United States. And we know that President Zelensky said to President Biden, I don't need a ride, I need more ammunition to fight here. Which is something that I think is it's very courageous, it's very brave. So we know that the Russians hope that when the government will live on their own, then the people within Ukraine will fight a little bit more, and then a pro-Russian government possibly will come up. Okay, so what it sounds lately, it's not that the Russians planned right away to go and occupy all the cities and invade those cities and change the government. They hope that it will happen with a little bit of a push. But now when the president of Ukraine said, I'm not living anywhere, I'm staying in Kyiv, the morale is high, and it seems like the plans of the Russians not going, so maybe in the talking soon, hopefully, all we can do is to pray that the fighting will end, because we don't want people to lose their lives. And also a lot of the Jewish people in Ukraine, I have a friend Ilya, he's my age, he's 29, he cannot leave the country, even though he's Jewish, because no Ukrainian man between the ages of 18 to 60 can live. They must stay within Ukraine, and it doesn't even matter if you have a dual citizenship with another country. If you're a Ukrainian citizen between the ages of 18 to 60, you must stay. You cannot leave in case you'll need to be fighting. So we have seen that right now there's already 10,000 people that requested to submit their documentation to make Aliyah. So we're expecting a big Aliyah wave right now from Ukraine to Israel. And we also know that the Israeli embassy that moved to sleep in the Polish side of the border in the day they crossed the border to Ukraine to rescue Israelis and others in which they can, but at night they sleep in Poland. We know that the documents for Aliyah, it's blowing out of proportions right now. And we always see across our history that whenever there is a war or some fighting, Israel is the one place where Jewish people can go and escape the fighting and be protected and call it a home. So on that note, I would like to finish and to thank you very much for giving me the chance and giving me the opportunity to speak in front of you and in front of this beautiful congregation. And I don't know if we have time for questions or anything like that, so I'll be happy to ask or answer, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And thank you once again. Thank you, and Shavua Tov, everyone. Any question? Yeah, go ahead.
What can the average American do to help the situation in Ukraine?
It's the $1 million question. The average American. So I know that, of course, there is many answers to it. So one can say we got to call our Congress people and our representatives to tell them to support U.S. sanctions on Ukraine. When I spoke to my dad's cousin, they said that they feel like the sanctions actually working. They said that they feel that the international community gets together, they put so much pressure on Russia that it actually encourages the Ukrainian morale to keep fighting for themselves, but also they feel like it helps. Okay, so that's one way. Another way, of course, it's to support Jewish communities in Ukraine. I know that organizations like, there's a lot of organizations in Ukraine that do work on the ground. Chabad, for example, in Ukraine, they're all over Ukraine, and they help the Jewish community there. So maybe by going on their website and supporting, like in Students Supporting Israel, we just work on college campuses here. But I'm sure that there is many ways to support the Ukrainian Jewish community as well in their effort, but also by raising awareness online, by talking about it. I see a lot of people posting that the Prime President of Ukraine is Jewish. It's something that suddenly a lot of people are proud in, something that not a lot of people even knew up until 2 weeks ago or up until 3 weeks ago. But now it's like the Jewish man that saves Ukraine, So that may be something that we can do in order to increase awareness. And once again, also I think the most important thing for us is to come to terms that we can move and make sure that we support the Ukrainian fight for their own sovereignty, while not forgetting the past in which Ukrainians were killing so many Jews and were some of the biggest anti-Semites people out there. You know, it's time for us to remember the past, but also to know how to move forward and look forward towards the future.
I've heard that there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the Ukraine, and that Jews are not doing well there. Is that not true?
So we cannot ignore that there is a lot of anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Like, it's a fact. You know, it's a fact, but there is also a lot of anti-Semitism in Russia, and there is quite a bit, maybe not as much, but there is anti-Semitism here in the United States. You know, we have seen what happened to congregations in the past years and even 2 months ago. You know, so anti-Semitism, the oldest virus on the planet Earth, is always there. Now, the question is how much? We know that Ukrainians, they were not Jew lovers, that's for sure. They killed 14 family members of mine, and some that people don't know, it's not even necessarily the Nazis that were killing the Jews in Babi Yar, because you cannot kill 33,000 people in 3 days with 2 battalions of Nazis that also need to do other stuff around the city. A lot of the people that were killing the Jews in Babi Yar were the Ukrainian collaborators, that they were giving away their Jewish neighbors, that they were beating up their Jewish neighbors in the streets, and were treating Jews like dirt, even worse than dirt, you know, like subhuman. So of course it is there, but now the question is, once again, something I brought up, it's if Israel can work with Germany, if the Jewish community can travel to Berlin and to Munich and to watch German football teams play and saying, not having an issue with it, but while remembering what happened, I think it can also be this case with Ukraine, because it was not always just Ukraine, it was also Belarusians that were killing Jews. And in Lithuania and in Latvia, that are members of NATO, they were also killing Jews and they were murdering them. So the question is, what can we do in order to move forward? And I'll tell you, when we were in the meetings with the Ukrainian officials, so the first thing, and that's actually ironic, the first thing that we as the leaders of Jewish organizations from the United States walk into the room and sit down in front of officials, Ukraine is doing everything it can in the fight against anti-Semitism. You know, 10 years ago, I don't need to go far, but 10 years ago it was unheard to even hear someone saying such a thing. You know, but that's the first thing they say. We're doing everything we can in the fight of anti-Semitism. Now, how much they're doing, that's a different question. Is it impactful? A different question. But they came some quite of a way, and our job, I think, is to push them even farther, to make sure that if Ukraine becomes a westernized country, a democracy, like it wants to become, they also know how to accept the Jewish community while knowing what they have done 80 years ago.
2 questions. Are you able to communicate with the people in the Ukraine right now, or cell service and other areas of communication closed down? And 2, is Israel providing any assistance or resources?
Yes. So in regards to communication, I'm able to communicate. I spoke on the phone yesterday with my dad's family, his 2 first cousins, and video, like everything is just fine, it's not a problem. The question is if they can pick up or not, because it was pretty busy around Kyiv in the past 3 days. Now, in regards to the second question of what Israel does, so Israel finds itself in a delicate situation, because Israel, while it has great relations with Ukraine, and the president there, Zelensky, is a big supporter of Israel and a big friend, also Israel has the Russians sitting on the Syrian border. You know, so we cannot just do whatever we want. Israel kind of walks on a glass, you know. And what Israel does, though, they send a lot of humanitarian aid. A lot of humanitarian aid was already sent into areas in Ukraine that need some more food or more medical supplies and so on. Israel also, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett called today and spoke to Putin, and he offered to be a negotiator between Ukraine and Russia, to have Israel as a negotiator between the 2 countries, because it has such a good relations with both countries. So it's probably not going to happen, because I think that the Russians will go with a different negotiator, but Israel offered such a thing, which only shows like what Israel is capable to do in that part of the world. So, and of course there's many other ways that I'm sure I don't even know about, you know. I'm sure that the Aliyah documents to help the Ukrainian Jewish community to come to Israel, maybe other ways, but that's the main ways in which they try to help. Let's go all the way to the end. How the war started? So that's a good question. So basically, thank you for asking a question. It's awesome that someone so young asked a question. This is great. So how the war started, for a few reasons. Of course, there's the Russian side of how the war started, right? And then there is also the Ukrainian side of how the war started. But the main part is that in the past 30 years, not even in the past 30 years, since 2014 when Ukraine had the revolution, I'm not sure how many people even know that Ukraine had a pretty brutal revolution in Maidan when people were protesting the government that was supposed to strike a deal and become more and more a part of the EU. And the pro-Russian president of Ukraine decided not to do it and backed away in the last minute. The students started to protest. As the students started to protest, people were shot. Then people got mad and more people went to protest outside, and the government tried to shut down those protests, and basically a revolution took place in 2014. When that revolution in Ukraine took place, two areas in Ukraine, which is Lugansk and Donbass, decided to separate. It's areas that have a lot of Russian-speaking people, and they said, we don't want to be part of this government, we're going to separate from Ukraine. And that's the separatist forces today in eastern Ukraine, which is close on the Ukrainian-Russian border. And there until today, for 80 years, they were fighting. The world doesn't know about it, but 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in the Donbass and Lugansk since 2014. You know, a lot of times when in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one person is being killed, the whole world goes crazy. But when 15,000 people over there is being killed, it's not good news, it's not as interesting. So as the fighting there continued, Putin, that always had big aspirations, the president of Russia, Putin, always had big aspirations for a strong Russia. He never gave up on the idea of Russia being a world power, not just a world player, but a world power. And he decided to help those separatist areas by weapons, by ammunition. About a week ago, he recognized their independence. President Biden said, who is this guy that can just go and say that there's new two countries in the world? That's unheard of. And basically Ukraine, that always already had a situation of almost like a civil war in the past 8 years, with the Russian recognition and with Russia saying that Ukraine commits genocide on the Russian-speaking population, Russian forces entered Ukraine, and Ukraine had no other option but to push back and fight back into fighting that is the biggest fighting since World War II on European soil. Any other questions? If there are, I'll be happy to answer any other questions, but those are great questions so far. I think there was someone in the front here.
I would just, if Russia is successful, if they take over the Ukraine, do you think that Russia will continue to go? Because when I traveled a few years ago to Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, they always were worried that Russia was going to come back in and take them over.
Of course, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, they're actually members of NATO. The Balkan countries, they're members of NATO. And when I was in Washington, D.C., following my trip to Ukraine, a month after, we met with the Lithuanian ambassador to the United States. And the Lithuanians, they do not like Russians. And that's an understatement. I'll say it, that's a very understatement. And they're always worried. You know, they said that we're small countries. You know, for Russia to take over Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, it's a matter of 24 hours if needed. You know, and that's why they're so worried about it and so concerned, and that's why they became members of NATO. And that's why actually Russia, that already saw Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia becoming members of NATO and saying, I have NATO sitting, Putin said, I have NATO sitting on my front door. For Putin to have Ukraine looking towards NATO, this is not on my front door anymore. He said, this is in my living room. You know, this is NATO coming to my living room already. And that's what was also Putin's big problem with Ukraine, looking more west and looking towards joining NATO. Now, the Baltic countries, NATO has an Article 5, that if one NATO country is being attacked, so then the entire NATO is going for a war. So I think Putin not going to go and attack one of those countries, but no one knows, because in his aspirations, he sees the Soviet Union. He was a young KGB officer when the Soviet Union collapsed. He saw that this is a disgrace, that Russia lost from its power. For the next 30 years, he felt that the West always looks at Russia as like this second string player and never took it seriously or treated it seriously. So Putin always had the aspirations to return Russia to the player and to the power that it's supposed to be, and to work with the West when you work with them on the same level and not when they look at you from above. So it's a question to Putin, but so far he struggles a little bit in Ukraine, so we'll see. But it's only been 3 days, you know, maybe now he's not even using everything he can, because if he wants, I feel like he can make it much harder on Ukraine.
Where should we donate if we want to help
Okay. So again, like I'm not an ambassador of Israel or Ukraine, and I don't necessarily have the links myself, but as I said, Chabad, for example, I know that Chabad on their website, they have a lot of local Chabads, let it be in Odessa, let it be in Kyiv, let it be in Lvov, and other areas in Ukraine, and they work with the Jewish communities there and help them, especially now when there's 300,000 refugees, some of them or many of them are also Jewish, and they help those people. So maybe that's a website to go and check out. I know my job is with students supporting Israel, not with donating to the Ukrainian people, but I can also do the homework and forward it to Valeria that invited me here and find out. Okay, excellent. So if there is no any other questions, thank you very much. I appreciate your invite here. I appreciate it, and Shavua Tov. And hopefully the fighting will end very soon. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.